All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to interRel's weekly webcast. This week, we're focusing on customers that are migrating from financial reporting, otherwise known as FR, to EPRCS MR, which is their management reporting technology. My name is Opal Alapat. I've been with interRel for a number of years. I've been working with EPRCS for about 3 years and FR for over a dozen years. And I have a lot of personal experience with EPRCS, especially the management reporting tool. I wrote the book on EPRCS that's available on Amazon, and I am very excited to share my lessons learned with this migration process. So first of all, for those of you who may not be familiar with EPRCS, EPRCS is a cloud reporting technology in the EPM space. Oracle does provide it at an additional license. EPRCS stands for Enterprise Performance Reporting Cloud Service, and it handles a number of EPM reporting needs. So here's my Swiss Army knife of different types of reporting that customers like to do, and the areas where EPRCS can help you are all highlighted in green. So there's a lot of customers on the EPM side who want to do static reporting. This is kind of like your financial statements and things like that. Your very pretty reports with static data that users are not going to change. There's data visualization, which is more on the BI side. Statutory reporting, if you have heard of or are currently using a tool called Disclosure Management, that is a statutory reporting tool. It handles EPRCS as well as XBRL. And they have replaced that tool in the cloud in EPRCS with a product called Disclosure Management, so the same name. But just know that that is not something we're going to focus on today, but it's something that EPRCS handles. There's also dashboard reporting if you want more visualizations, ad hoc reporting, which is handled a lot through SmartView. There's a lot of users that love Excel and SmartView. Narrative reporting, which is one of the first use cases for EPRCS. This is where you combine your grid and your charts with actual text narrative to explain the data. EPRCS handles that very well in their narrative reporting part. And then there's also drill-through reporting, which EPRCS handles in the management reporting tool that we're going to talk about today. But the definition of drill-through is in quotes because it's different for every technology. So for instance, in the BI cloud tool that Oracle has, which is really called OAC, and handles the dashboards, drill-through there actually means drilling through all the way to the transactional layer. But in EPRCS, all it really means is using related content. So it can help you jump from one report to another report, external data sources, etc. But this gives you a good view of all the different types of customer reporting that we see and which ones EPRCS can handle with its suite of products. So here are the suite of tools that comes within EPRCS. There's narrative reporting, as I mentioned before, which is one of the first use cases for this product back when it first came out in 2015. So narrative reporting allows you, again, to kind of marry your text narrative with grids and charts. And it actually handles this through SmartView. So that is the cheat behind narrative reporting. There's management reporting, which we will talk about today. This is a replacement technology for financial reporting, otherwise known as FR. And there are many customers who have understood where EPRCS is going, and they have decided to license this product and convert their FR reports to MR, which is what we're going to focus on today. Another technology that comes in EPRCS is the data storage container. This is actually Essbase behind the scenes, but it is a very light, bare bones version of Essbase. So just be careful that you will not see the word Essbase in the documentation because it's such a light version of it. There's no member formulas or calc scripts. It's just kind of a rack and stack type of situation. It gives you one application with up to 5 databases. And then the final product, which actually is a separately costed product, is the disclosure management option, which is the replacement tool for the on-prem disclosure management product. And as I mentioned, this is something that you can license with EPRCS, but there's an additional cost for disclosure management. All right, so the very first question that people ask as they think about why am I talking about FR to MR migrations is FR going away? And the first thing that I want to make sure that everyone is aware of is that FR is not going away in the near term. It is probably something that they're going to think about 5 to 10 years from now, completely sunsetting that tool, maybe even earlier, but in the near term, definitely not. And the reason why is because it is the on-prem static reporting tool of choice that comes with Oracle EPM. So if you have Hyperion Planning or HFM, Essbase, etc., your on-prem version has FR in it. And they are going to support it, as far as I know, with the new 11.2 release that's coming out on-prem. And so that means that this would be supported for a number of years. In addition, when EPM Cloud was first rolled out, FR was the reporting tool of choice that came with it. So if you license Planning Cloud or FCCS or one of the other products, FR comes out of the box with that EPM Cloud technology and at no additional cost. So the short answer is FR is not going away anytime soon, but the longer term strategy of Oracle is to remove this product. So just know that, and that's why this webcast is very important as customers try to understand which reporting technology they should be migrating towards. EPRCS is one of the great technologies that is a replacement tool for FR. You need to understand your options so that you can eventually migrate that direction. All right, so part 2, now that we've done an overview of EPRCS, some very important reporting considerations that every customer should be thinking about, regardless of what technology you're using. So the first consideration, and the reason why I put these together, by the way, is because I do see a lot of customers really struggling with this or not really thinking about reporting as well as they should. So the first consideration that I'd like to say is my PSA, which is reporting is the intangible item for customer applications. If you think about Essbase, if you think about planning, if you think about a consolidations tool like HFM or FCCS, at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're taking the data in that application and you are displaying it somehow, usually in some type of reporting. So it's very important, and I say this all the time to customers, that this is a critical object in your application, your list of reports, because at the end of the day, this is ultimately what you're working towards, is some type of visual representation of the data in your application. That's what you're using to make all of your big decisions. So my argument here is that reporting should be considered up front because of this. And my reason for saying that is because countless times the following has happened. 3 months into a project, the customer says, oh, wait, we need insert some data element in our application too for this report. Then what happens is the consultant team has to adjust the application design, the data integrations, calculations, reporting interfaces, etc., which then leads to backpedaling, change orders, project flow disruption over time, and ultimately chaos. So I highly recommend that all customers consider reporting up front because it is such a critical path application object. Here's consideration number 2. When you are moving from on-prem to the cloud, there are limitations on how many applications can exist at a time. So for instance, in case you're not aware of how the cloud architecture works, if you decide to migrate from, let's say, Hyperion Planning into Planning Cloud, or just become a new consumer of Planning Cloud. In the on-prem world, Hyperion Planning allowed you to have pretty much unlimited applications and plan types. It was really constrained by your server resources. But in the cloud, you are limited. So you license a single pod, which comes with a test and prod instance, and each instance is allowed to have a maximum of 1 application. So if you are someone who has multiple planning applications and you need to keep it that way, then this means that you are now a multi-pod environment customer, and there are ramifications if you do that. Another use case, which is pretty common, is if you decide to purchase OAC Essbase in addition to an EPM Cloud product. That also creates a multi-pod environment because Oracle OAC Essbase is in its own pod. In fact, it's in its own architecture called PaaS, which is Platform as a Service. And EPM Cloud is in its own pod, which is SaaS, which is Software as a Service. So you automatically will be in a multi-pod environment. And this information is not necessarily explained up front to customers, so I think it's really important to go through. What does it mean when you move to a multi-pod environment, and what are those ramifications to your end reporting state? So there are reasons why FR, and I say Web FR because in the cloud world, they've gone away with Financial Reporting Studio, which is FRS, and they've replaced it completely with Web FR. So now you develop all your reports in the web. But there are reasons why FR may not be a good reporting technology for you when you're moving to cloud. And the reason why is because of multi-pod environments. So just in case you're not aware of how FR works in the cloud, it is not like on-prem. In on-prem, you have your own FR server, and it can connect to different products, all from a centralized location. In the cloud, FR does not work that way. It only connects to the product and instance it comes with. So in my prior example, as I was explaining what a pod comes with a prod instance and a test instance. Each one of those instances in a pod comes with its own install of FR, and that FR can only talk to that one instance. I often think of it as like a koala on, like a tree branch, and it only sticks to that tree branch and it can't even climb to another tree branch. So that's kind of how FR works. And so you're not going to be able to talk to FCCS, planning, and SBase all from a single FR install in the cloud. It doesn't work that way. You are limited to only the instance that FR comes with. So that's very important because that obviously has deep ramifications on your data integration and your reporting. Some people with their FR reports have multiple data grids in a single FR report that are attached to different data sources. So that is not going to work in the cloud as is. Not that there aren't workarounds here, but you're not going to be able to do that because FR only speaks to the product and instance it's attached to. So if you're using FR in Planning Cloud, that means, let's say you're talking about your test instance, FR can only talk to planning test. It cannot talk to anything else. So having different data sources and that migrated FR report is not going to work. Or folks create complex FR reports where maybe they have multiple data sources in a single grid, which is something that you can do with on-prem FR. So Web FR is not going to work for you because those data sources are probably in separate pods, just like the example before. Doesn't really matter if you're in the same grid or in the same report. The important point here is that you have multiple data sources, and you can't really do that in Web FR. So here are your workaround options if you have a multi-pod environment. So A, you migrate your FR reports to EPRCS MR. Now, narrative reporting, which we call NR, could also work, by the way. It's just a very different tool, but you could do it. But one of the considerations when moving to EPRCS MR, which we will talk about later in this webcast, is that EPRCS MR does not have full parity with FR yet. So, and actually it's April now, it's early April, there are no updates to the EPM Cloud products this month. So as of even April, it still does not have full parity with FR. So that's a very important consideration, and we are going to talk through some of those very important feature differences between FR and MR. In addition, if you decide to migrate to EPRCS, which is a good choice in general since that's the future direction of reporting for Oracle EPM, the other thing you have to consider is that now there's new licensing costs. So in the on-prem world and even in the cloud world, FR comes out of the box with the technology that it's wrapped with, and it is not at any additional cost to you. But when you move to EPRCS, you have a suite of products at your beck and call, and so of course there's a licensing cost attached to that. And so that, it's actually a value-priced tool, but that could be expensive if it was a budget item that you weren't considering. The next option for multi-pod environments is continue using FR. And the workaround here is that you just need to make sure that in your reports that all of the data elements that you're going to use in them are moved to a single pod. So what that might mean is that you have to, let's say, take data from FCCS and push it into Planning Cloud so that you can then report with Web FR out of a single source. And you might have to create some additional data integrations. whatever makes sense. And yes, customers are actually doing this because they want to continue using specific FR features that are not in full parity with MR at this point in time. Now, the upside to continue using FR is that there is no additional cost to using it, so that's great. But again, FR is an antiquated technology that will be going away at some point in time, so just keep that in mind. The next option is to move to SmartView. I'm going to be honest, I'm not a fan of this option because what that means is that you are basically going from a tool that is purpose-built for static reporting to a tool that is purpose-built for ad hoc reporting, which means your users can, unless you put in certain protections in Excel, your users can change these reports. In addition, they can reformat these reports. So again, there's a lot of flexibility with Excel SmartView, which is why it is good at what it does. But there's also a downside to it. So the good thing is that there's no additional cost to use. In addition, you can directly export FR reports you've already built into SmartView, but then you're going to have to reformat them. But one of the other downsides is that there's no distribution option. So you're going to have hundreds of SmartView sheets, possibly slightly different versions of the original, all existing somewhere on a network drive, and that can become a nightmare very fast. And then one more thing to consider in a multi-pod environment is the whole workforce security. So we have a bunch of customers actually that have decided to opt to move when they go to EPBCS, decided to buy 2 pods. One version has the other frameworks in it that are not workforce, financials, projects, etc. And the other pod has just workforce in it. So they can segregate the security and ensure that no one has access to sensitive data within their workforce framework. Now, the problem with this, though, is that when you have workforce in a separate pod, that means that you are now in a multi-pod environment, right? And so there are, of course, ramifications with that choice. Obviously, you have segregated security because you have separate licensing costs that you have to figure out. In addition, you have reporting considerations now. So you may need to use EPRCS management reporting for consolidated types of reporting due to the multi-pod incompatibility with FR. You're going to have to figure out what is your reporting strategy going to be when you do this. And then, of course, data movement. So if your workforce data elements need to be included in consolidated reporting, then maybe those data elements now need to be moved to your other planning pod, which has your financials and your other consolidated data in it. So that just might mean that you need to create new data integrations. Basically what we've been talking about this entire time. So just know that this is a special circumstance. There are customers that had everything in one Hyperion planning environment and on-prem, then they move to cloud, decide, oh, we want workforce in a separate pod, and then don't really think through the multi-pod ramifications. So that's why I wanted to call this out. Okay, so consideration number 3. The MR developer experience. So for those of you who are considering moving from FR to MR, just remember that EPRCS MR is a completely different product, which means that there is going to be a learning curve both on the developer side and on the end user side, which I'll talk about next. So let's talk about the MR developer experience. So here are some examples of how developing in MR is different than developing in FR. One of the most important things that you will notice is that MR actually runs a validation for errors. And if there are any errors, no one can run the MR report. Some examples. For instance, if your MR report has any empty formula rows or columns, because MR does not allow for that, or let's say it has formulas that point to invalid parameters. One of the biggest lessons that I've learned moving from FR to MR is that FR allows you to get away with a lot of stuff. And that stuff is not good. MR does not. So MR checks for this. It gives you a list of errors if it finds them. And then you can't even run the report until you fix all those errors. So on one hand, greater report integrity for EPRCS MR, awesome. But on the other hand, now you have to spend this time up front after you do your migration to fix all those errors. It's a one-time event though, and your reports are going to be better for it, but just know that that's waiting for you. The next thing is that EPRCS MR is somewhat object-oriented, which means that each object has its own developer screen. And this is one of the first things that you're going to encounter as an MR developer. Is so when you go into an MR report, you see the entire report with its header, body, and footer. If you go to edit a text object in the header, now that opens into its own little edit screen. And when you press the close button, that takes you out of the text editor screen back to the report. But if you press the close button in the report, it takes you completely out of the report. So you just have to be very cognizant of where you are and when you press that close button and where it's going to take you. It can be very frustrating at first because you're just not used to the way it navigates. Another important thing that's a very big difference between FR and MR is that there is no page for dimension layouts. So in FR, you can put things in the point of view, the page, the rows, or the columns. There is no page in MR. Now, that doesn't mean that the concept of a page doesn't exist, but it's definitely not a drop-down format. It'll just put it in the POV, and then you allow users to select different types of items. The next point is that there really truly is a lot that is the same between FR and MR. It's just you kind of have to figure out the navigation to figure out where it is, and sometimes similar functionality is called something else in MR. So for instance, in FR, we call it expansions. When you set an expansion in the rows, let's say, and it's on a parent member so that people can, quote, drill down into those expansions and then see all the different members underneath that parent. In MR, it's called zoom. So you just have to kind of get used to the new nomenclature as well as where everything is. But at the end of the day, what I would say is if you already know FR, the learning curve is fairly small for MR. There are a couple of big gotchas, trying to understand, can I restrict, what users can select in the POV? Some of those are bigger learning curves, but overall, it should be fairly intuitive for you to develop an MR if you already know FR. So now here's the part as an MR developer where you really need to pay attention. And again, this is now as of April 2019. Here are the parity features that are lacking between the two tools, and these might make or break your decision to migrate to MR at this time, depending on how important the feature is to you and whether or not you're currently using it. So the first two are the first two that we always hear about from customers. Does MR have batches and bursting? So the quick answer is no, it does not. Both of those are expected to be released later in 2019, but that is one big parity gap between the two technologies. In addition, cascading and books, those are also expected to come out later in 2019. Auto calculations, I don't know a lot of customers that use these, but they're actually a pretty interesting feature in FR. But those are not set to be released, I think, anytime soon, maybe after this year. But that is also a big parity gap. Multiple data sources in a single grid, so just know that that is not coming at all in MR. But there is a workaround given. You can put multiple grids on a single report, and then kind of like an Excel formula, you can reference a cell from another grid into the main grid that you show in your report. So that's the workaround for that. Full integration with SmartView or an export to SmartView ad hoc. So just know that there was a feature added in February. It is not the same thing as the full integration. What it allows you to do is to take any chart or grid within an MR report and basically export it into SmartView into ad hoc query mode. So you're not going to get the formatting, you're not going to get any report-specific grid functions that are only in the reporting layer. But it does give you something to work with so you don't have to recreate an entire report. Annotations and planning and annotations. So they're coming out with their own version of that, which is going to be called Notes. So that will be coming out. I'm not entirely sure of the time frame, but it will be coming out because it is on their current roadmap. Linked objects, saved objects, those are on the roadmap. Any object can be hidden in FR, not just the grids. So right now you don't have that capability within MR. You can only hide, I think, just the grids. So that's something on the roadmap. Custom reporting sizes. So if you don't have like a legal size or a letter size document, you have other types of reporting documents that you need to customize. Those are not available right now. Hopefully those will be on the roadmap soon. Butterfly reports. We don't have a lot of customers asking about this, but there are a couple that sometimes need to have this. So butterfly reports are on the current roadmap. So hopefully those will be released soon. And then there are a handful of functions that exist in FR that don't exist in MR. These are lesser known functions though, lesser used functions. Pretty much all of the commonly used ones are in. So that are the list of features that are not in MR today, which is something very important that you need to pay attention to, because if you're using these in FR today, it might be a deal breaker for moving to MR. All right, the next consideration, the end user experience. So we just talked about the developer experience and how that can be different. Let's now talk about the end user experience and how that can be different for MR. So some examples, this is not a comprehensive list. So how users access EPRCS MR, and I'll go more into detail on that. But this is a new reporting product, right? So that means that things are not going to work exactly the same. I'm not entirely sure how your users access FR today. Maybe they use a task list, or maybe they just go directly to the report. Maybe it is distributed to them in some way. But the way that you access EPRCS MR is going to be a little bit different because we're talking about cloud. So I'll go into that in a second. In addition, I just mentioned this, a user is not really able to download the fully formatted report to Excel in MR. That is something that they're able to do in FR, but this is on the roadmap. In addition, in the same vein, they're not able to download a query-ready version of a report through the web. They can do that in FR. In MR, they can kind of do this. They just have to go through SmartView, and only the grids are supported. Again, the concept of a page dropdown doesn't exist because there's no such thing as a page in MR. So there are some interesting things that you can do with dropdowns in FR, right? Like you can combine multiple dimensions and then it creates a dropdown list of every single combination of the members of those two dimensions. So that type of functionality does not exist in MR because they don't have this concept of a dropdown or a page. And then here's some other things. This is on the flip side. Things that users can do in MR that they actually can't do in FR. So because MR is built on a forward-looking architecture and platform, that means that Oracle can iterate and create new features very quickly. So here are some things on the flip side that exist in MR that users can't do in FR. So in MR, end users can change from a member name to an alias, vice versa in both. They can just set that for the report that they happen to be looking at. They can also save the MR report as a snapshot in case they want a static view of the data that they want to look at later. They can download a raw XML of the report, which is really used for other cloud products. And they can determine the zoom levels in order. So as I talked about earlier, there's a feature in FR called expansion. It's called zoom in MR. Just imagine being able to take your zoom and be able to set different options on it. Like how many levels do you want to see and what order do you want to see the parent versus the children in? So there's some interesting things that they can do in MR that they could not do in FR. So here are the situations when MR may not work out for your end users. So what I would say is the biggest consideration here is when end user experience is your highest priority as you move to the cloud, and you need the end user experience from on-prem to cloud to be completely seamless, and users need to have all reports run out of a single book, or maybe they're using some reports in a single book, and they're using FR for some of the reporting. And or users don't want to have to navigate to multiple URLs or to multiple areas of product to access all the reports. So if you really need your end user experience to be of the highest priority, any one of these three things could be a deal breaker for you. Just remember, this is a different product. So that means that navigation is going to be different. It's not going to be a seamless experience to transition from FR to MR. It's very similar though, and with the right change management tactics and training, you can definitely get your users on board with MR, but there are some things that might be deal breakers for them, and you need to consider that. And then here is where we talk about how do users actually get to MR. So this is where there's a potential hurdle because there are some parity gaps between how you can have users access FR and how you can have users access MR. So as you guys may have heard, when you buy multiple EPM cloud products, there's a feature called the EPM business process. And what that allows you to do is you don't want your users to have to navigate to 3 different products, right? Because that's just really confusing to have them to navigate to 3 different URLs to access all their products. Let's say you have like FCCS, PVCS, and EPRCS. That's 3 cloud tools. You don't want your users to go to 3 different places, right? It would be easier if they could go to a single place and then just click the thing that says FCCS or click the thing that says EPRCS, and then not have to worry about remembering all those different URLs. So Oracle created a feature over a year ago called EPM Business Process. And what it allows you to do is embed your products into one single product so that you don't have to have your users navigate to different URLs. However, there are some limitations with this with EPRCS right now. So there are different cards or icons that you see in EPM Cloud, and the set of those and how you see them displayed is called a navigation flow. So if you use navigation flows within EPM Cloud, the way that it works with EPRCS, if you embed that into, let's say, your planning cloud product, so you don't have your users going to both places, you can create a card within your EPM Cloud product that ties to a single MR report. And that's fine if your users only ever use one report. But if they use more than a report, this may not be the best option. So what you can also do is create a navigation flow that has a series of MR reports in it, utilizing the horizontal or vertical tab options within navigation flows. So then what could happen is your users log into Planning Cloud or FCCS or whatever, and they see a card that basically says, these are all your reports. They can go in there and then they can find all of their different MR reports through the horizontal and vertical tab options. That's probably your best option, to be honest, at least right now. The next thing that's important to know is end users cannot use a task list to go directly to an MR report. And this is one of the big gotchas that's different between FR and MR. So if your users are really tied to their task lists and they use them all the time to get through like their planning tasks or their consolidation tasks or whatever, it's real easy to just tie an FR report in the list so that you can have them review their numbers and things like that. But you can't do that with EPRCS MR right now. So I've asked the Planning Cloud group to add this enhancement because it's really important to some customers. So it's on the roadmap, but it's not going to be released in the next couple of months. The other thing that's important to know is sometimes in a task list, you can just put a URL on it. But unfortunately, the way that EPRCS MR works is you can't just navigate to the report and then copy that current URL with all those different alphanumeric codes at the end and then hope that the next user can just navigate to it with the URL. That does not work. I've tested it. So that means that you can't even use that option in a task list. So what we're going to have to do is basically wait for Oracle to enhance this feature so that task lists can tie directly to MR reports. And then you'll have the same parity between FR and MR once that gets released. So at the end of the day, which tool is right for you then? Is it EPRCS MR or is it FR? Which one should you go with? So some important ramifications of moving to MR. We already talked through some of these, but again, it's just really important that you know this up front. So MR has a separate cost to it, and it may be something that you didn't realize. If you are transitioning from FR to MR, think about how many FR users you have, and you're going to need to buy that many licenses in EPRCS to have the equivalent functionality for your MR users. Just remember that you can always negotiate with your Oracle sales folks. In addition, don't forget that MR and FR are not full parity. They will be near full parity at the end of 2019, but they're not there now, and it's going to take them a while to get there. Also know that it can be a disjointed experience for end users if they have to use a combination of FR and MR. And by the way, there are customers who are doing that because MR provides some features, FR provides some features. Until that parity exists, they're actually using both reporting technologies. Also, it can be a disjointed experience for end users if you're using task lists and you use them to guide your users through reporting. Because you can't tie MR to a task list, that becomes a disjointed experience as well. And then finally, just remember that when you move to EPRCS MR, it is a new tool, which means that there's a new learning curve. Luckily, it's much smaller than some of the other EPM Cloud products out there. But just know that that's what that means, is you're moving to a new tool. There's going to have to be some training involved. So here's a very simple flowchart of deal breakers. So how would you know which tool to use? Well, here are some deal breakers that might make that decision for you. So let's say you have Hyperion on-prem, you have FR on-prem, you're moving to some product in cloud, or you're in Web FR already, and regardless of what your path is, you're considering moving to EPRCS MR. So the first deal breaker is you don't have the software budget to purchase EPRCS. Well, there you go. Your decision has been made for you. You will probably need to move to Web FR. The second deal breaker is FR has pivotal features, not yet in MR, and you're actually using them today. For one of the customers that I recently worked with this year, one of the big deal breakers was auto calculations. They really needed auto calculations. They also needed books. And because those two features do not exist in MR, they are now actually using a combination of FR and MR. Until MR has full parity, then they'll move everyone to MR. So that might be a deal breaker for you, which means that you have to stay in FR. Number 3, FR has 1+ data sources. And in the cloud, it means that you're also going to have more than one data source, because let's say you're in a multi-pod environment and you just can't, or you don't want to create data integrations to house all of your data in a single pod to use FR. That's a very big consideration, and that's why I made that a reporting consideration up front, is again, this whole concept of a multi-pod environment and how that impacts your end reporting. So if you're in a situation where you just can't move that data between your pods, or maybe you don't want to for security reasons, if you really truly need a report that consolidates your data from multiple data sources, then you need to think about moving to EPRCS MR. All right, so that was part 2, which really went through a lot of reporting considerations. So now let's kind of reset and let's talk about the actual migration process. So what does it take to move from FR to MR? How much time? What are the steps? Is this easy? Is it hard? What does it look like? I'm going to tell you right now, it's pretty cool. All right, so let's talk about step 1. And I'm just kind of gloss over this since you guys are going to get a copy of the slides. But just like you would migrate FR files, it's almost the same process for migrating from FR to MR. So the first thing you're going to do is you're just going to export all the FR files that you need from FR. You can do this through your FR Explorer repository, either on-prem or cloud, depending on where you're moving from. Find all the reports that you need to migrate. You can migrate an individual report. I'd recommend you start with one report just to kind of get used to the whole process, and then you can do multiple reports if you want. But you can either do a single report, which is a .des object, or you can do multiple reports, which it will combine into a zip file. Then you will save them locally to your computer. Then what you'll do is you'll go into EPRCS, you'll go into the library card and into reports, or whatever folder you want to migrate these into. In fact, I highly recommend that you create a folder called migration or something like that and just put them all in there so they're not mixed with anything else in case you have special security. Then what you will do is there is a cog wheel on the right-hand side of that screen, and you will go find import. Then you will browse to wherever your FR export is. Be cognizant of your different options here. So if it's obviously on your computer, you're going to want to say local and then go find your folder. And then you want to tell it where do you want these imported reports to go. Probably the current folder that you're in. Do you want to overwrite the existing objects? Do you want to include the same security permissions? Again, that all depends on where you're coming from. But just be cognizant of those. Then you'll press OK. You'll get a little message that says, hey, your import's running in the background. You'll receive an email when the import is complete. And then the bottom screenshot shows you the nice little email that you get. Usually takes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. And you're done. Well, you're done with the import process. So now that you've imported those reports, and what happens behind the scenes is EPRCS is actually converting your FR report to, the language and proprietary stuff that EPRCS needs to understand your FR report in MR. Doesn't take very long. When you're done, just like in FR, you're probably going to have to go change the data source because it's probably going to have a different name in EPRCS. So what you'll need to do is either report by report, or you can do multiple reports at once. You'll use the same little action menu to change data source, and then you will point to something that you already have listed as a data source in EPRCS. So that's a step that was assumed, by the way, that you've already created all your data source connections within the EPRCS library. And then what you're going to do in this step is then change to whatever that data source is. Step number 4, this is the hardest part, which is fixing errors. So remember back to what I said earlier about MR does not let you get away with all the same errors that FR allows you to get away with. So now you're going to have to go through this process. You'll only have to do it one time where you go and fix all of those errors. And you might be lucky and not have any errors. That is a rarity, but for very simple reports, you may not have any errors at all, which is fantastic. So how do you know if you have errors? What you'll see is if you look in the screenshot, see this little thick red line in the background? That will be seen at the top of your MR report. If you click on it, it will then open to a list of messages. Anything with a red circle and an X is a required error message that must be fixed. Anything with a blue circle and an I means it's informational only. You do not have to fix it. The report will still run, but I highly recommend that you go back and fix those anyways, just because it's good not to have any problems. So what will happen is you will not be able to run your report until every single red circle X error is fixed. So just keep that in mind. I mentioned that earlier in the webcast. You really need to go through and fix all of those. Now, some of you might be thinking, if you're FR developers and have been FR developers for some time, can I hack the DES file instead? Absolutely, you can do that. Sometimes it is way faster to hack the .des file exported from FR and fix all these errors in there and then just import it again with everything already fixed. So yes, that is an option. I will talk about that a little bit later in the webcast. Step number 5. So you thought you were done with the errors, but you weren't. Sometimes what happens is when you actually go to run the MR report, now that you've fixed all those other errors, sometimes, it's pretty rare, you go to actually run the MR report and then you get a whole new set of errors. And these are the errors that you get when you go to run the report. It's a different set of errors. So what will happen is you'll run the report, it'll churn for a little bit, then you get this ugly little error message. So make sure you take a screenshot of it, and then you have to basically go into the report and fix all of these errors. And you just keep repeating until all errors are gone. So then when you're done, you're pretty much done at that point in time with the entire migration. So then what I'd suggest you do is just kind of do a quick validation of the MR report. If you're lucky enough to have the same application and data, then honestly you could run them side by side, your original FR report and your MR report, and just kind of double check everything. You're going to want to check data. You're going to want to check report calculations. So those are calculations that only exist in your report layer and not in your source. You want to ensure that the formatting came over correctly. So there are, a couple of things that you're just going to want to validate to make sure that everything looks like it should before you release these reports to the end users. And then one extra step is, just like in FR, you do have to secure your reports. So what you can do is you can create groups within access control in EPRCS, and then you can assign those groups to folders where your MR reports are grouped, just to keep everything dynamic. It's a real simple process, but just don't forget about it, because your users need to have access to these reports, and so you have to secure them access. There's no access by default. All right, so the migration process was pretty quick because it actually is pretty quick. The longest part of that is fixing the error messages. So now let's talk about some migration best practices. So tip number 1, as we just talked about with security, if you guys are used to creating security and managing security layers within your Hyperion and Oracle EPM applications, and this is not going to be news to you, but you always want to keep your security dynamic, and the best way to do that is to use security groups and not access by individual users, because that is a nightmare, and it's basically like hard coding. So make sure that you use security groups and that you secure through folders. What will happen is you put all your reports in different folders according to what they are, and then users will be able to inherit access. If they're given access through a security group to the folder, they will inherit access to all the reports by default in that folder. So that keeps your security nice and clean and dynamic, and you don't have any individual hard coding going on. Tip number 2 is to hack your FRDES files to save time. Now, I would suggest that if you've never done this before, you do this very carefully and in iterations. So the first thing that you might be asking, if you've never heard of this before, is why would I do this? Hacking seems like a very negative thing to do, and I will agree, it is a negative thing to do if you don't have experience with it, so you have to proceed with caution. So again, why is this required? Well, because you're kind of forced into it. Sometimes if you have very complex reports, you might have 100 errors on it. Let's say 50 of them are like the exact same error. Well, there's got to be a faster way than going manually through the report and trying to fix that error 50 times, right? Yes, this is the faster way. So again, until those error messages are gone, you won't be able to run the report. And so you need a quick way to do this. Some other reasons why this is required, I mean, just remember FR and MR don't have full parity, so there might be other weird error messages that come over just because of the parity issues. Let's see. Some surgery is required, just FYI, and it is a one-time exercise. So once you do it and fully get through your error messages, you will not have to do this again. So it's just basically paying up front, and then you have nice, clean reports that work, right? And then you shouldn't have to do it again. So tip number 3, take the time to understand the root cause behind those error messages. Don't give up so quickly. And I think I have a couple of examples in here. So some of these are really obvious, like they do a good job of explaining it to you, and you just need to like try to understand, and then you understand what to do. So here is a perfect example that a lot of people get when they're first creating their MR reports or they're converting from FR. Some object called text2, which is probably a text box in your header or footer, must fit within the header of the report. So one of the things that MR is really stickler about is that all of the report objects on the actual report need to fit within the report. So you can't have text boxes going off the edge of the report size. And so you will immediately get an error message that tells you to fix it. So you can see this error message. It's pretty self-explanatory. So again, try to understand what it's telling you. And then the simple fix to an error message like this is really just to resize your text box. You can grab the corner of it and resize it and make sure that it fits within your reports, and then you can even align it. So you can center it vertically or horizontally and things like that. Here's another example error. This one's a little bit more complex. This one is saying, hey, in this grid, and it gives you the name of the grid, there is a formula cell that references a cell that does not exist. So basically go fix that. So this is an example of an FR error that is allowed that MR does not allow. So it really does not like it when formulas are referencing blank types of cells. So the simple fix is to fix the formula. And if you have a ton of these, then go hack the DES file instead. And then my recommendation is you would hack the DES file, re-import it, see if there are any error messages, go back and hack the DES file again, re-import it, et cetera, until you fix them all. And if you've never hacked the DES file, again, proceed with caution. Maybe make one change at a time and then re-import to make sure you haven't like messed up the entire report. The DES file uses XML, so I'd find a good XML editor. And if you accidentally remove one extra character, you can mess up the entire report. So that's why I'm saying please proceed with caution on that. Tip number 4 in migration best practices. So EPRCS, regardless if you're using narrative reporting or management reporting or even disclosure management, what it will attempt to do is render the font that you're using in your underlying report for the web. So for instance, if your corporate standard is to use Arial, then obviously you'll see a lot of Arial in your EPRCS reports. So the best way to render that font so it looks as pristine as possible is to upload a copy of that font into the fonts folder in the library. And Oracle does recommend this in their documentation, but it's really important that you stay cognizant of font licensing. So you're not really allowed, according to licensing rules, to just take any font that you find on your computer and upload it to EPRCS. You have to be cognizant of your font licensing. If you're using a custom font as a company though, hopefully you already have a license for that font. That's totally fine to upload. And then what EPRCS will do is if you upload that font, it will render that font better in the final version on the web. So it's recommended that you do this, but again, just be cognizant of font licensing. And then the next tip is remember that you have to fix all MR report errors. Don't like fix some of them or just ignore them and then turn them over to the end users, because the end users will not be able to run the report. They will immediately get an error message, and that just creates headaches, right? So just make sure you fix all the errors. And then tip number 6. So just like in FR, there are user preferences that can be integral to the end user experience. And you need to make sure that you cover those with users in training. So we'll cover just a couple. I know, here's one that's important. So FR has this as well, but in EPRCS MR, the preview point of view works just like FR. What it means is if a user has this checked within their preferences, then when they go to run an EPRCS MR report, it will pause before running the entire report, which might, take 30 seconds to churn according to how much data you have in it. So it's good that they check this beforehand so that they can pause, ensure that their point of view is set to where they want it to be, and then they can proceed. There's like a little play button. They'll push play, and then it will go and run the report. So it just gives them that one extra step to pause and ensure that they have what they want to see on the report before it takes all that time to churn and actually render the final report to them. And there's other user preferences that are important as well. You can see on the left-hand side here that there's general preferences, notification, formatting, etc. You'll want to make sure that you cover these with your end users in training. All right, and finally, part number 5, other resources. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys had access to this really awesome documentation. It is written by Oracle, and it goes through details on the differences between FR and EPRCS MR. And what I've seen with Oracle is, for the most part, they update their documentation on a monthly basis. So right now I'm giving you this webcast in April, and there were no updates to EPM Cloud this month, so all of the information I gave you that were updated as of March are still true right now, but maybe in a couple months they've actually added some new features to make that parity gap go further and further away. And so you might want to understand what those differences are in a couple of months, and so you'll want to check this documentation to find those detailed differences, and they do a really good job on this. All right, well, that is the end of the webcast for today. I hope this was helpful to you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@interrel.com, and the person who receives that question will route that to the appropriate person. So thank you very much for your time this week. I hope you enjoyed the webcast, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this. Take care.